Hey everybody, we're the good doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Erin.
I'm Dr. Kristen.
Welcome to our continuing Black History Month, where this month we are focusing on stories that center women in different parts of Africa. So last week we did the Queen of Katwe, which was set in Uganda. We are traveling across the African continent today to Liberia, to the west coast of Africa, and to a fascinating place that I knew very little about prior to this documentary, and a documentary called Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which is about the the mobilization of women across religious boundaries and divisions to organize and activate and protest for peace, protest to the end of the war in Liberia that had been going on since 1989. And the documentary starts in the early 2000s and traces the story of Leymah Gbowee and a bunch of other activists who really just say, we're really tired of running, we're tired of being raped, we're tired of our children dying, and we'd like peace now. And it's a fantastic documentary and story of these phenomenal human women and the sacrifices they made and the way that they were able to be activists and to negotiate a settlement, a peace settlement in a very, very war-torn country dominated by male combatants, but we'll get into gender in a minute. So that's the gist of the documentary. It's a 2008 documentary that was bought by Amazon Prime and is now available on Prime Video, and they list it as 2016, but thankfully Dr. Kristen looked it up and found that it looks like it was made in 2008. I was confused as to why it was so low tech.
And I've owned the DVD since at least then, so that's why I was like, it's not 2016. I haven't bought a DVD since 2016. It
was on Uli. So there's a lot of things that happen in this documentary. There's a lot of fascinating aspects to Liberia as a country, including class dynamics, ethnic groups, control of resources, warlords, child soldiers. It's a whole cornucopia of factors going into this. So we're going to dive into some of them that the documentary doesn't go as deep into. It's a great introduction to Liberia. And if you are prompted by this to dive into more, I think it's a good place to start, because there was lots of stuff that I was like, I had no idea. But we'll start unpacking some of the key points we wanted to make about specifically class and ethnicity and gender in conflict in Liberia. Dr. Kristen, where would you like to start?
I would like to start with the fact that Liberia was founded by former American slaves.
Which I knew in the way back, but totally forgot.
So essentially, Liberia was this joint project between Quakers and slaveholders that was sanctioned by President Lincoln and a whole lot of other people. The Quakers, of course, wanted to give them freedom, and the slaveholders were like, okay, well, if we give them freedom, then they'll stop the slave rebellions. So to quote from, it was in, I'm reading from quote here. So in 19, pardon. So really, really quick, in the middle of the 1400s, because of the physical location of what would become Liberia on the Pepper Coast, which is what that part of Africa is called. We have the Ivory Coast, we have the Pepper Coast. There was a lot of like outposts in a way. There were trading posts, and there was not, from what I can read or tell, excessive colonialization there was more cooperation and trading between.
That was going to be my next question. I was like, who colonized that land?
Technically Americans. Like, technically is really what it sounds like to me. And if somebody is I have the privilege of knowing some Liberians who have said the same thing. So if that's incorrect, please correct me, because I've been saying this now for a couple of years.
Would be good if you told me I was wrong.
I would love it. So in 1816, the American Colonization Society was founded, which is the thing set up by, which just sit with that word for a minute, sit with that title. The American Colonization Society was set up by Quakers and slaveholders in 1816. By 1822, they are sending free peoples of color to the Pepper Coast to voluntarily establish a colony. So just as a heads up, one of the major downsides to sending giant groups of people from a place that they've normally been living to another place is a lot of them die. Weather, different. Diseases, different. Food, different. And so a whole lot of that happened for a little while. But by the time we hit 1847, it's established as a colony. There's a Declaration of Independence.
And I will say too, the other downside to sending a group of people from where they were living to another place is that there's very often indigenous folks in that other place that
exactly where I was getting to.
Already living there.
Already living there. So they just kind of rocked up like Americans do. And they were like, knock, knock, this looks great. We're going to live here. Thanks so much for your time and attention. And just...
Oh, colonizers.
Kind of behave like colonizers. So this is a great example of how you don't have to be a white person to be a colonizer, but do you have to carry white energy? And that's pretty much what these folks did. So I'm going to quote here from a book, Slaves to Racism. We will find a link to this because I just discovered this title and we'll be reading it.
That's right.
So Slaves to Racism, An Unbroken Chain from America to Liberia by Benjamin and Anita Dennis.
Cool.
They argue that the Americo-Liberians, so the folks who came, the free people of color, replicated the only society they knew, which was the racist structure of the American South. Believing themselves to be different from and culturally and educationally superior to the indigenous people, the Americo-Liberians developed an elite minority that held on to political power. They treated the natives the way that American whites had treated them, as inferiors. Now I'll say, I remember, it's all credit to my professor at Baylor, Liling Nan, who when we were studying the Old Testament looked at all of us and said, the oppressed will always become the oppressors. And we all kind of scoffed. And I'll tell you that's the language of human history.
Yeah.
When given the opportunity. So there are exceptions.
But not in this case.
Not in this case. So here we go back to the quote. The natives could not vote and could not speak unless spoken to. Just as people of color were prohibited from marrying white people in most of the United States, the indigenous Africans could not, by law, marry Americo-Liberians. Even when some indigenous Africans became educated in Western ways, they were broadly excluded from government. Indigenous tribesmen did not enjoy birthright citizenship in their own land until 1904. Americo-Liberians encouraged religious organizations to set up missions and schools to educate indigenous people. Mm-hmm. So at this point, the last census data, by the way, is that Liberia is considered a secular nation in that it has separation of church and state, but really it's Christian. Like all their schools are Christian. It's like Northern Ireland in a very real way, honestly, except they've got 87% Christian and then about 11% or 12% Muslim and then some other groups in there. The divisions within those groups is significant in terms of, if you've watched our videos before, I've talked about syncretism, which is when you take the local customs and then religion from elsewhere and marry them all together. And that's a lot of what happened here, especially within Christianity. There's Lutherans, but I would imagine Lutherans from Minnesota heading to Liberia would notice some differences. Just like Catholics from New York head to Mexico and notice some differences, because that's what religion does. It morphs.
Yes.
So into this world, in 1847, we get the Constitution. There's wars and things like that. But by the time we hit I'm scrolling. Fast
forward through the wars and such.
Fast forward through all the wars.
Other people are Liberian historians, so you can go find them if you would like all the other stuff.
So much more data than we give. So they didn't have to have an African independent movement like a lot of the other countries, but they helped out a lot in the African independent movement. Everything appears to be shitty but stable until, at least for the indigenous people, from what I can read. Everything appears to be fairly stable until 1980, and this is where we start to get military coups.
Right.
So as we sit here now, by the way, the president of Liberia is a man named George Weah, who is an incredibly famous African footballer. He is the only person born identifying as African or born on the continent, I'm not sure, to win FIFA's Player of the Year. Like, it's a deal. I cannot remember what teams he played for. Forgive me. But I do know that stat because I remember my brother getting really excited about how soccer teaches you leadership when he was elected president. So, but he's the 4th president. They've had this country since 1847. What's sitting here in the year of our Lord 2021, and he is the 4th president.
Wow.
So kind of know that. Imagine the kind of environment that kind of legacy can foster. It, while like Charles Taylor was not like necessarily directly in this world, he certainly claimed spiritual legacy from it. So all of this, this is the context into which Charles Taylor becomes honestly one of the most ruthless dictators of the 20th century. If you don't know enough about Charles Taylor, I would encourage you to do a quick wiki search. Just do a Google. He is why we know the term blood diamonds, to be completely honest. His treatment of the people of Sierra Leone, as well as his own people, is abominable. He like the Hague doesn't like the Hague. He went to the Hague. He was so awful. He went to the Hague. He was really, really, there's a pause while my brain catches up with my mouth. My mouth catches up with my brain. There is a term when we study sub-Saharan African politics called the big man, the African big man. And he tends to be the dictator that is larger than life. This is Charles Mugabe. This is Charles Taylor.
I was about to say Charles Mugabe.
Is that his first name? Isn't it Charles? But Mugabe, which was portrayed, by the way, by Forrest Whitaker in The Last King of Scotland. Won an Oscar for it. Absolutely should have. So the big man is a term that you may see thrown around if you dive a little bit more into African studies. Charles Taylor and Robert Mugabe. There we go.
Robert, yeah.
Because my husband always makes the joke when we see Robert Mugabe whine. He's like, why did they not be more careful that it's not a Ugandan dictator? Anyway, so Robert Mugabe and Charles Taylor are some of the prototypes of that concept of the big man.
Right.
Who used their gender and their manipulation of their faith and their manipulation of their education to control their people.
Right.
And Charles Taylor did that for sure. He was a big Christian, lots and lots of faith-based language, lots of talk about how God had sent him for the people of Liberia, which is why the fact that the women's reaction to that was to play him at his own game was so genius.
Yeah.
He was very, by what I've been told by people, very famously anti-Muslim, very evil and ugly about Muslims. I've not found recorded statements about that. That is just hearsay. So again, if that is incorrect, please tell me. That it led to hostility between Muslims and Christians. And he fostered that and quite liked that. And then all of that. So there's your Liberian context in a nutshell. Other thing I would say that I find very interesting about Liberia, and that might help us understand this documentary a little bit more, is that polygamy is still quite widely practiced within, especially rural Liberia, from what I can understand.
Okay.
According to the last census data and the statistics that I can find, about 1/3 of women are in polygamist marriages.
Yeah.
There's not we are not here on this channel. We do not believe that polygamy is inherently abusive. We do not believe that polygamy is inherently a problem or anything else. But that the relationship between men and women in terms of statistics and in polygamist cultures does lead, we believe, to explain some of the behavior of the men in this conflict.
Yeah. And I think we were talking about this offline before we started filming, as we often do, to kind of gauge our responses. And I think for me, that's where I'd like to start, because the gender dynamics are so stark in this documentary. And that's what we both said to each other independently, was that this is and we study conflict and genders all over the world. We're experts in Northern Ireland, and several other conflicts have a great deal of knowledge. But this, to me, was the starkest visual representation of the class distinction and dynamics, gender distinction and dynamics in armed conflict, in violent conflict. Every time you saw a young boy or a man, they were combatants, they had weapons.
And were armed combatants, that's very clear as well.
Yes.
The sheer amount of guns in the Liberian Civil War is...
Oh my God. Very upsetting.
Shocking.
Lots of guns, lots of weaponry, projectile missiles, like
people just like casually walking around with them on their shoulders while they're wearing a Teletubby backpack because the world is complicated.
Yeah, so for me, that's one of the things that sticks out in the whole documentary. And I love the context that we just provided, that you just gave me too, because I didn't know a lot about it, in terms of understanding the class distinctions as well. I would love to know more about the ethnic makeup of the different warring factions.
Yeah, because there's so many tribes, and we didn't touch that at all.
Whether the groups of warlords were founded based on like ethnically indigenous groups, and clearly this history of reverse colonialization again, impacted the way that they felt about the Amero-Liberian dynasty of leadership and control of resources and power. And like the voices of the women in these documentaries are so clear and articulate in terms of saying that what war is about. It's about power and control
and jobs.
It's about resources and all of these things that the men were fighting themselves over. And so we get introduced very early on to Leymah Gbowee, who was the leader of this movement. She's a social worker. Big up social workers.
She won a Nobel Prize for this work as well. So
she did win a Nobel Prize in 2011 with the at the time the then president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And Leymah has a dream, right, that the women have come together to pray for peace. And
if you watch this documentary for nothing else, please watch it to watch Leymah's brain. Like, get to know this woman.
She's fire.
Spend an hour and 20 minutes with her.
Yeah. So she's like, you know what? Praying for peace is not a bad idea. So we follow the lineage of the Christian Women's Peace Initiative and how Muslim women get involved in it. And it sets up this dynamic really easily, that the women are very aware that all these men are making the decisions and why they're making the decisions, and that women have very little power in Liberian society, especially to demand peace. But they do it anyway through all of these forms of nonviolent resistance, which, as a like conflict and resistance expert, this was literally my peanut butter and my jam. I was like, yes, talk to me about.
I stopped taking notes because my wrist hurt. I was taking so many, and I just sat there like,
I was like, talk to me about your nonviolent forms of resistance, please. So they stage a protest at a fish market. They dance and they sing and they make T-shirts and they learn
badges. I loved the badges.
Yeah, they have different badges for all their little groups. And they talked about the importance of coming together in this space and how they learned to empathize with each other for being very different. And the thing we talked about offline, this documentary does not get into the religious conflicts and differences between Christian and Muslims in this part of Africa, in Liberia specifically. I would have loved more of that. They kind of say like, oh, well, they wouldn't really work together, and
this has never happened before.
This has never happened before.
To unpack that just slightly more would have been great. But in 2007, when this was made, that is not a narrative that we were interested in exploring as a world, and so I respect that. But
yeah,
now,
and I think it's really powerful that this was cross community, because it had to be, and they make that very clear. Like, it wasn't going to work if it wasn't all everybody. The women. Mm-hmm. And then the women are like, oh, nobody's really listening to us. I'm succinctly like summarizing a whole lot of stuff they did, but this is one of my favorite things that women do, and that these women did. They're like, we're not getting a whole lot of support from the men. You know what we should do? A sex strike. And they're like, we
should find more women. So like they started going to the internally displaced persons camp, and they started going to refugee camps, and they were like, hey, we are not the only women that want this to happen.
Nope.
So
yeah, I mean, there's a whole, like, you'll get it all in the documentary. There's a whole, the warlords start taking over parts of the countryside and forcing people like to flee to these internally displaced.
Warlords who are freeing the people from Taylor, but who are instead just trying to get jobs for themselves.
And steal all their stuff and rape their women. It's super cool. This heavy sarcasm in case anybody misses that. And so they're forced to all of these camps all across the country because it's not safe for them to go home, or they're not allowed to go home, depending on what part of the country they live in. And they just start getting together and they're like, y'all, we are not alone in this. There are a lot of us that are upset about this. Let's get this together. And then they were like, but the men still aren't listening. So you know what we can do? We can say, no, what is that line from Bride and Prejudice? No life without wife.
Yeah.
Like no peace, no sex without peace.
Yep.
Nope. And all of a sudden the men started praying for peace too.
And we're sure that there's, these are succinct stories, and peace is never linear. And like, even within this, I know that there were really big setbacks that aren't talked about. And but the narrative of this is incredible. My personal favorite part is we finally, the women are why the men agreed to peace talks.
Yes. They forced both the warring warlord factions
and Taylor's government.
Yeah.
The pomp and circumstance of getting Taylor there, then Taylor was there, and that's exactly when he got charged for like hate, war crimes, and it was all a mess. But the men, in my words, continued to behave like children that were on vacation. And so the women of Liberia became their mothers and treated them and grounded them. They sent them to their rooms. And the women sat outside the doors and said, you're not leaving until we get peace.
Don't come out. Don't come out until you're going to talk to people. And like, we're kind of making jokes about it because it is really inspirational. But
just incredible. Like, I can't.
There's a scene where, it escalates into a conflict, the sit-in, as protests can and often do. And the scene where Leymah is just like crying into the cameras and into the media that have come to just say, like, we just want this to stop.
Why don't you want this to stop? Is like innate in her thing. Like, why do you want to keep killing your people?
Why aren't you taking this seriously? Like, why? And it was just really beautiful to see. And we were both talking about offline how we weren't deeply emotionally impacted by this in terms of crying, like emotive, and shaking our heads at how desensitized we are to conflict and violence in that way. But that was kind of, those emotions got to me. And when they were so emotional about how the peace talks weren't progressing, but they started to progress, they get a peace agreement, they get the UN peacekeepers coming in, and the whole documentary is just a series of instances in where the men aren't quite doing it right. And these women come back and they're like, this isn't how we disarm. It's not going to work.
The UN comes in and they totally screw the pooch.
The UN comes in and they're like,
we've done this before. Can you just let us take over? Here's our clipboard. We have a list. Like, we're good to go.
And they were like, no. We're UN peacekeepers. We can do this.
We have this here.
And they botched the whole thing. So
again, outsiders, sometimes we just got to take a seat. We got to take a seat, guys. We don't know what's going on.
I love the women. They were like, this is not the first time we've disarmed.
This is not our first rodeo. Please allow us to show you how things work.
And so they kept having to come back and advocate. And so then they get the disarmament. They start to work on reintegration of the former combatants, especially the child soldiers, which is a really, really hard part of the documentary. And I work with a lot of men who, if they were in a country not a white Christian one, they probably would have been called child soldiers, and they often call themselves child soldiers. And so, I know how young men particularly can be manipulated into committing heinous acts of violence. And so to watch that part was really powerful for me. But the women come in and they're like, we don't want to talk to these perpetrators. We don't want to bring them back into society, but we have to for this to succeed. And like, it was all of the times they said that we have to do this for it to succeed.
The pragmatism of
women who are just fed up.
Like, yeah, I have no idea if I've told this story on here, but on this channel, but one of the reasons I feel so called to empower women in various African countries, and that's a piece of my life calling, is that the first time I went to Rwanda, I went to one of the places where the conflict was And if someone would like to know about my trip to Nairobi, I'd be happy to talk about that in another context. It's something that literally shifted the purpose and shape of my life. Was one afternoon. And this woman told us, like, she was raising the children that she got from being raped as a weapon of war. She never saw her family again. They were all killed in one day. Like, I mean, just pick a feature. Like, her life was terrible. And my very naive early 20s American self said, how could you possibly raise these children? And she looked at me and she said they were hungry. Like, I was the dumbest person on the planet because I was. Like, I'm sitting there from my place of privilege, like, you can choose how to survive. Yeah. And she just very clearly cut me down and was like, they were hungry. I was hungry. I had to feed them. Now they're my children. That's how you live next to the man who raped you, because you have nowhere else to go and he owns the potatoes.
Yeah. And like, also this idea that the children couldn't control how they were conceived, and she couldn't control how she conceived them. But yeah, and so,
and that attitude is this documentary.
Yeah, the pragmatism and the realistic understanding of what was motivating the combatants and how they had to negotiate all the time for what they wanted to see and what they believed Liberia could be. And so you get to the point where we've gone through disarmament and now we're electing a democratic government. And so the women turn to voter registration and activation, and they're like, we have to get people to the polls, so let's go do that. And it was this constant. So, I mean, very obviously give them the Peace Award, the Nobel Peace Prize, went to Leymah Gbowee and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was elected the first woman president in Africa and elected president of Liberia in 2005, was it?
2005, and then she was president until 2018.
Yes, so very long time. She has been a bit controversialized since then.
She's a human being and not a saint.
She's
and
complicated.
She's made some decisions that were great for Liberia and some decisions that were terrible.
As all presidents do.
Aligned herself with some cretins and aligned herself with some great people. And I have friends that that sing her praises and say that she was amazing, and I have other ones that would like her erased from history books. So it's nothing is simple, and obviously this documentary shows it and wants to show these women in a positive light as they rightly deserve to be. But certainly, she was a complicated president and a complicated politician. Which I think you have to be the first person after Charles Taylor, to be completely honest.
I mean, I can't even imagine inheriting that kind of political legacy and like trying to make that work. But I love that this documentary was made.
Oh my God. Please watch it.
Please watch it. It's, in terms of gender and conflict and the way we tell stories, we so often focus on the combatants and the politicians, which end up disproportionately in any conflict around the world being men. And so a lot of times we don't know the stories of the women peacekeepers and peacemakers as well. This is true very much so in Northern Ireland. The Women's Coalition has been largely written out of a lot of history in Northern Ireland, and the work of the Monica McWilliams and the Mo Mollins and the Linda Irvines and the Dawn Purvises have all been kind of written out or lost focus. So anytime there's a focus on women peacemakers and peacekeepers, we're going to be shining lights on it.
Yeah, we are.
I think I've run out of words of praise for the women's peace movement in Liberia, and pray the devil back to hell.
So where are we traveling to next?
Yeah, great question. I think we're going to Nigeria. ?
Exciting.
Pause while I check. I have it listed in our month. We are going to Nigeria. We're going to do a fiction film again, The Wedding Party, which is
Nigeria is the home of the film industry on the continent. Which Nollywood is what they are called.
Yes.
And so we've watched a Bollywood movie, and now we're going to watch a Nollywood.
We're going to watch a Nollywood movie. This one came out a couple of years ago. I believe it's on La Netflix if anybody wants to watch in advance of our review of it. But I'm super excited to delve into this part of African film that I knew nothing about. I had no idea the Nigerian film industry was this big. It's like the second largest. I think it is the second largest film industry outside of India.
Yep.
So we'll be watching The Wedding Party, and we'll be talking about it next week.
And we hope you join us then. We'll talk to you then. Bye.
Bye.